Chapter 18 Black Wildcat. Finn was the boy from the north, the legend Devin only pretended to be. Rebecca laughed loudly in shock. Maylin stared, and Roland scoffed and shook his head, like he still didn't quite believe it. Even Rumpus looked impressed.
"The bond, never lost,"
Rumpus said, so wisely that it was hard to think less of him when he dropped his head and ate a mostly rotten apple from the ground. "Rumpus," Connor said. The boar looked up, and Connor dropped his head with respect. "Thank you for fighting with us."
"Thank you,"
Rumpus said roughly,
"for fighting for me."
The boar paused for a moment, then also dropped his head to the ground. At first, Connor presumed it was to eat another piece of fallen fruit. Instead, the boar dug his massive tusk into the dirt of the nearest tree. It only took him a few moments to emerge with something hanging from it. "Is that?" Rebecca began.
"The talisman,"
Connor finished.
"Here,"
Rumpus said, stretching his neck out. Connor reached forward and took the pendant from the boar's shining tusk, his muscles tensing at the animal's smoky breath on his forearm. The talisman, the iron boar, was very heavy, and a deep rust colour, similar to Rumpus's hide. It was shaped like a boar, of course, and while Connor couldn't be certain, he suspected the miniature boar's tusks were made from bits of Rumpus's full-sized ones. They were too perfect not to be.
"Thank you,"
Connor said.
"Thank you so much."
He slipped the talisman around his neck and turned to the others. Carmo rose, still at Roland's sword point. Uraza reluctantly got off Devin, though Maylin was quick to brandish her own dagger right under his chin.
"Wait,"
Roland said.
"Rumpus, we promised to free him for the talisman." "I will be fine,"
Rumpus snorted, but Roland shook his head.
"We've got to get him out of here,"
he said. He turned to Rumpus.
"Come with us. We'll tell MacDonald how you fought off conquerors on his grounds. He'll owe you a favour."
"Hopefully that favour will work for the rest of us too, because we don't have the hair," Connor said.
"Hair?"
Rumpus asked.
"MacDonald's lost spirit animal. He ran off before Finn and I could convince him to return. What do you think MacDonald will care about more? That we didn't hold up our end of the bargain, or that we stopped his castle from being invaded?" No one answered. It was hard to tell with someone like MacDonald. Connor tucked the talisman under his shirt. With a resigned sigh, he led the others back through the orchard groves, toward the castle. The trek back through the massive gardens took nearly as long as it had to find the boar. Rumpus followed, uprooting entire trees when they got in his way, rather than walking around them. The two prisoners sulked silently the whole way, or rather, silently until either Roland or Maylin poked them a bit too hard with the tips of their blades. They arrived back at the garden steps to see most of the castle staff waiting for them. The night sky was already brightening. Rumpus had elected to wait within the boundary of the tree line. MacDonald and his children stood ahead of the others. "Kindly tell me, what sounded like a war going on in my garden?"
MacDonald barked at them, motioning toward the orchards.
"It was a war. Well, a battle, I guess. But it sure felt like a war,"
Roland said, and Carmo made a sound of agreement.
"Lord MacDonald,"
Finn said,
"Devin and Carmo allowed other conquerors onto your grounds to help them capture Rumpus the boar and take his talisman."
MacDonald's eyes widened, and a vein on his forehead began to pulsate. Seeing this, his children stepped away.
"You mean to tell me these two not only insulted my hospitality, they invaded my home?"
"We didn't invade!"
"Silence!" MacDonald roared. "Guards, relieve me of the burden of Devin Trunswick's presence,
Lock up him and his companion immediately, and force Devon to call his spirit animal into its passive state."
"It is in its passive state, sir," Connor said shyly. "This wildcat belongs to Finn."
Now, all attention shot to Finn, and a ripple of shock and awe raced through the crowd. Even MacDonald's lips parted in wonder as Finn stepped forward, his wildcat, Don, moving regally beside him. Don made Elder look like a kitten. He was all muscle, with eyes as bright and yellow as the sun reflected off water. His black fur was dark velvet.
"The wildcat? The one from the legends? That means you,"
MacDonald said, lifting his eyes to Finn. Suddenly, MacDonald was laughing, voice booming.
"The true legend, in my home. I knew it couldn't be that snub-nosed Trunswick child."
Finn bowed a bit, though he seemed rather bashful of the attention. Connor could relate. As the tittering and excitement died down, Finn cleared his throat.
"My lord, we did not stop the conquerors on our own. We were assisted by none other than Rumpus, the great beast."
At this, Rumpus, who had been mostly lurking in the shadows of the garden, stepped ever so slightly into the dwindling moonlight. The sheer size of him was obvious, even from this glimpse. The boar's eyes landed hard upon Lord MacDonald. A hush fell over the assembled crowd. A few people went indoors, wary of Rumpus's ferocity. Connor found himself wondering for the first time just how the great beast had ended up within these walls. A story for another time, perhaps.
"It would be very honourable, sir," Connor added, "for you to release him from captivity in return for his heroics."
MacDonald paused. He puffed up his shoulders a bit and somehow managed to look nearly as large as Rumpus.
"The deal, if I recall, was my hair for Rumpus and his talisman. I cannot allow lawbreakers to simply suggest new laws for their own convenience."
"Oh, come on," Roland snapped. "You'd be overrun with conquerors right now."
"My castle, my law,"
MacDonald barked, and there was a buzz of agreement among the crowd, though Connor suspected this was merely because no one wanted to disagree with a man like MacDonald. He shook his head, furious with himself for not convincing the hare sooner. Behind him, Rumpus made a deep sound in his throat, one that was loud but strangely gentle, almost like a cat purring. Rumpus inclined his large head, indicating over his shoulder with a perfect tusk, then stamped a foot on the ground softly. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. MacDonald's face paled, and, even from afar, Connor could see his lower lip was trembling. It was the hare. It hopped from behind Rumpus, slowly, cautiously. Rumpus looked down at the hare, who peered back up at him. They were speaking, though whatever they were saying was beyond any of the humans present. The hare now turned and looked up at MacDonald, who sank to his knees in one swift motion. The sight of the great Lord MacDonald in such a position sent a chorus of gasps from the assembled servants. Rumpus looked up at MacDonald.
"Say sorry."
"I'm sorry," MacDonald said immediately.
"I'm so very sorry." "Say never again."
"Never again," MacDonald said, voice pleading.
"Say you want."
"What?"
"I think the hare wants to know you want him," Maylin said. She wore a pained expression that Connor couldn't quite figure out. "That you are satisfied with him."
"I do. I am,"
MacDonald bellowed. With this, the hare sprang forward. MacDonald's face spread into a wide, teary grin as their hair leaped into the air and, with a flash, disappeared, only to reappear as a tattoo on the man's forearm. MacDonald rose, tears falling freely, and placed a hand over the hair tattoo, like he was afraid it would melt away.
"You're free!" he called out to Rumpus. "Free! I should never have locked you up. You have my gratitude and my apologies, Rumpus. I beg you to forgive me."
Rumpus didn't seem quite ready for forgiveness, but he patiently followed the guards around the edge of the castle. Then, when the gates had finally opened, he was patient no more. There was a sound that seemed to shake the entire castle, and suddenly the only great beasts left in the garden were the ones that had come with them. Chapter 19. Iron Boar. While MacDonald would have been happy to house the Greencloaks as esteemed guests for another night, Finn had insisted time was of the essence. Though Roland loudly protested, the boy had only slept a single night in that amazing bed. Their group set off that very morning. Understandably, they bypassed Trunswick entirely, shaving several days off the return trip to Lady Evelyn's. There they found a rather embarrassed Tariq, much improved from his previous condition. He was tired, but healthy enough to travel with them the relatively short way back to Greenhaven Castle. Finn, however, would not be going with them. After a hushed and intense conversation, Tariq returned to the group and announced that he would ask Olven's permission for Finn to remain at Glengavin. Finn would act as a much-needed emissary for the Greencloaks in the north. He was, after all, supposed to be their long-awaited hero. It took a little convincing that the group wouldn't need his protection on the way back. Tariq was clearly not yet at full strength, but Roland's enthusiastic and animated retelling of the battle in the apple orchard reminded the older Greencloaks that the four fallen had learned a lot on this trip. Still, they were glad that the remaining leg of the journey was so short, with just a single night's stop between them and home. Soon they would be back in Greenhaven, enjoying a well-earned moment of peace and safety. They had done it. Really done it. The second talisman was in Greencloak hands. That night, as Connor stood watch over the others, he revelled in the wide, starry peace of the Urin pasture for what might be the last time in a long, long while. And, just for a moment, he let his guard down. A cloaked figure loomed out of the darkness. Immediately, Connor scrambled to his feet, ready to cry out for the others. As he reached for a weapon, however, a low, familiar voice said, "Connor, it's me." Dawson. Connor blinked at Devin's little brother. He kept his voice quiet so that he wouldn't wake the others. "Why are you here? Are you alone?" Dawson pushed back his hood, revealing shiny, high cheeks and bright eyes. He nodded. "I have a letter for you." Connor marveled that the younger boy had tracked them down just to deliver a letter, but he nodded. Bashfully, he admitted, "You know I won't be able to read it." "I'll read it," whispered Dawson, taking the weathered sheet from his cloak with a sad expression. "But I'm sorry, Connor. It's from my father." He took a deep breath.
"Connor, son of Fenray. I know that we last met under unpleasant terms, and you will not want to listen to what I have to say. However, I would like you to imagine the starving faces of your family as Dawson reads you this letter. Then you should imagine all the worse things than starvation that can befall a woman charged with betraying her lord to his enemy, even if this enemy is her own son. I have a bargain for you. Give the iron boar to Dawson. As soon as it is in my hands, I will forgive your family's debt, and your mother will go free. They will own the land they work, and all the sheep they tend. They will be freemen, no longer my serfs. All you have to do is give Dawson the talisman. And if you do not, I will hold them to every last copper that they owe me, and I promise you, They will starve this winter, and the fate of your mother will be far crueler. Rest assured, this is the last you will hear from me either way. Devon has become involved in something that Trunswick can no longer afford to support openly, lest we collapse upon ourselves. Zarif tells me that if the conquerors may have their talisman, then I may have my family back. And so you will have yours. The decision is yours. With regards, the Earl of Trunswick.
Dawson folded the letter and put it back in his cloak. He at least had the grace to look horrified. Connor's hands shook as he imagined his mother's thin face on the night they'd escaped from Trunswick. How proud she'd been of him. Follow your heart. He glanced at the others. They slept soundly, trusting him to watch them on their way back to Greenhaven. They trusted him with this treasure of Rumfus. But his family had trusted him to help keep them alive too, when they'd sent him to Trunswick to be Devon's servant, no matter how hateful he had found that position. What was the right decision? Once the Greencloaks were victorious, surely his family would be free. But it would be too late then. Connor was glad that Briggan was in passive form. He didn't want to see the wolf's expression as he crept to his saddlebag and removed the iron boar. "I expect your father to keep his word," he whispered to Dawson. He gave the talisman to the boy. Dawson nodded. "I'll make sure he does, Connor." Tucking the iron boar into his cloak, Dawson ran into the night. The sound of his footfalls woke Maylin's horse, and Maylin sat up with a start. "Connor, is someone there?" she asked. Her voice made the others stir as well. When Connor, shattered with guilt, didn't answer, her eyes darted from his saddlebag, the flap hanging open, revealing the empty inside, to the place in the woods he still stared after. "I'm sorry," he said. "What happened?" Connor hung his head. "I'm sorry." Chapter 20. Consequences. The night was dark and full of animals. Maylin lay in her bed, eyes wide open. Her mind was full of the gardens of Zhong, her father's wise face, and the conquerors marching over the places she'd loved. The 4 kids were finally back in Greenhaven. It had been a few days since they'd returned, and Maylin's mind had been troubled for each of them. Their journey seemed to have been for nothing. Connor had handed over the precious talisman to the enemy. For his family. Hadn't she wanted to go to Zhong for her family when she'd had the chance? Hadn't he been the first to tell her to stay with them? Far off, down the hall, someone's spirit animal made a drowsy night noise. Maylin was far away from sleep. Since they'd returned, the fortress had been abuzz with the changes happening all over Erdos. People were taking sides, for the Greencloaks and the Fallen, for the Conquerors and Zarif's new false heroes. Rumours were on everyone's lips, rumours of an advancing army, and of the strange promise the army had, a potion stronger than the nectar of Ninani, which could force the spirit animal bond for anyone who drank it. The bile. There was no more time for wasted missions. "Gee," Maylin whispered. The panda had been drowsing in the corner of the room, but when she heard her name, she lifted her chin. Her eyes were sympathetic. "Help me." This time, when Maylin closed her eyes, searching for answers, the orbs around her were like droplets of water, brilliant, fragile, trembling. They spilled from her eyes and down her cheeks. Here were her choices. Stay. Go. One was both wise and logical. Stay. Fight alongside the Greencloaks. Build an army to fight this new threat. Go. Be an army of one. Find her father before it was too late. It was neither wise nor logical. G's intuition recommended against it. But it was the choice Meilin was going to make. She got out of bed and packed, silent and swift. The panda hesitated when Meilin held out her arm. She was offended, perhaps. After all, she'd offered her advice, and Meilin wasn't taking it. Or maybe she was concerned. She'd never refused the passive state before. With a frown, Meilin focused on the request. With a whimper, G vanished in a searing flash, reappearing on Meilin's skin, barely visible in the dark night. Meilin stopped only to pick up a map from the map room and a bag of food from the kitchen. Then she let herself out of the castle. She was going back to Zhong.